Hey everyone, welcome to another community forum where we answer questions that you ask us, particularly on our Discord. And sometimes we have topics of our own that we like to discuss as well. But I think this week we actually have a number of questions received that seem intriguing. So without further delay, why don't we begin and start answering them? So, Carlos, I think we're going to begin with a question from Joel. Is that right?
That's right. So Joel asked in on our Discord, anyone have opinions or suggesting reading on the origins of logic? I am reading Aristotle and Hegel in this. Hegel says he follows Kant in that we need to examine the nature of our own cognition first, but other than that, I don't have an opinion yet myself. Then I followed up to clarify whether he was more interested in the origins of logic as a discipline, as a science that was developed by individuals throughout history, or as a phenomenon. He clarified that he's more interested in it about as a phenomenon, which, in my opinion, is the sort of juicier part of this question. Nonetheless, I think history is important to sort of paint the picture for what we have today and possibly the biases of where we are today and whatnot. Um, so this is the question. The question is the origins of logic, and let me elaborate for maybe 30 seconds on what that could mean. The origin of logic, I guess, could be interpreted in many ways. One way is the age-old question for our viewers of what is computation, where does computation happen, what is computing, what is the computer running the computation that is doing the computations, and all these kinds of questions that are very familiar to our viewers and to this forum. But there's also, within computation, I think you can refine this question much more and say, if you agree that some kind of information processing and some kind of discrete state-based alteration and processes is something like computation, then maybe logic is just some proper subclass of such phenomena. And where do we find that? How do we recognize that? Obviously, we are going to talk about axioms of logic that seem familiar to us, that resemble the kind of logics that we use in mathematics or in conventional analytical philosophy. But the more broader question is, how do you spot those systems out in the computational wild, right? How do you spot that there's logic going on, and what do we mean by logic? What do we want to mean by logic, and so on. So I throw the questions. I have my thoughts. Anyone, feel free to riff.
Well, isn't logic just basically a list of rules for knowledge formation? Like more specifically, like inference rules. That's all you got, and that's the instruction how you form knowledge from whatever facts already, established. Like if I will just describe logic, like for 5 years old or something.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Well, I agree. Yes, that seems like a fair account of what logic is. But I think as humans, we can approach this in two different ways. And in some senses, like as mathematicians and computer scientists here, as researchers, we obviously have a very loaded concept of logic. We have the history of what the different logics that we use and the formality of which ones you might choose for all these interdependencies of axioms and conditions in one formal system or the other. But I think more broadly, you can also just look at generally sort of agents performing stuff in the world and think which of these agents are governed by some sort of logic, or how can you recognize that there's a logic running in the background. And would you call any computational logic? I don't think so. That's a waste of a word, right? Like, I mean, why would you just collapse the meaning of logic onto computation? But there seems to be something. I mean, maybe some other people will even go more specific and say logic is about truth, right? It's about truth values. Is whenever you can assign something like a truth value, you can do sort of truth value algebra. That whatever that is, that's logic. Like whatever you're doing logic, right? I mean, it can be quite specific like that, but. I mean, I'm saying it so broadly because I'm myself undecided. Like, I feel like computation and logic should not be squashed. I mean, it's a waste of a word. Why would you just, it's basically indistinguishable. I wouldn't say that. I mean, I would probably consider that logic is a subclass of computation in some sense. It's quite likely that I would want to agree with that, but to detect or to classify some parts of computation as logic, I think, it's an interesting debate. That's why I wanted to highlight this question by Joel, because I think it's quite juicy. I mean, there's a lot to be said.
And one question that we often entertain is, okay, if computation isn't just some term that we use synonymously with computation, if, as Nick put it, it's a set of particular rules, then the question is why those rules and not others? Why, when we say try to determine truth, why don't we use, just one rule fewer, or why don't we use, double those rules? That's, I think, looking at it in terms of your rule set, and the reasons why we've kind of, I mean, I think there is something to be said about logic as it's performed, like mathematically, computationally. How often does that correspond to the way in which humans kind of socially make decisions and establish truth? It's not clear to me. I'm not necessarily convinced by this notion that human societies have like naturally evolved to determine truth according to something like Boolean algebra. That would be pretty miraculous if truth was kind of universally held by humans according to some particular rule set, where if you just look at it formally, it's kind of arbitrary, but for whatever reason, humans are inclined to follow it, as though there's something about maybe the human mental apparatus that kind of favors it. But I haven't necessarily seen that. So I mean, that's another thing, which is we're speaking about logic as the phenomena, not as a formal discipline. But then the question is, what is that we're speaking of, and how closely related is it to what we mean by logic when we're referring to some set of inference rules?
Yeah, I think the history is relevant because it's mostly what's given us the word, right? So if we want to point to something, I mean, we look at the history and then we see the precedent for that's something that we're trying to point at. But I agree. I mean, trying to force some particular algebra, some kind of truth value calculus, I think is too reductive or too simplistic for what the question could be interpreted as, right? Because the question of where does logic come from, or what's the origin of logic as a phenomenon, I think to me evokes this idea of, you're an agent that, I mean, you're something that is quite efficiently modeled as an agent in our sort of computational models and mathematical models, but you also have this, as Nick pointed out, you have this knowledge building machinery, right? Like you're accruing knowledge, and I think the reason why we call it knowledge and we don't just call it, oh yeah, we have some tools and we navigate the world and we just apply those, is precisely because we assign this. There's this concept of truth, right? There's the concept of, is this true knowledge or false knowledge, or is this a misguided interpretation of the facts that have been presented or the observations that have been presented, and these sort of truth-seeking mechanisms that are very ingrained in the culture of science and the culture of intellectual discourse in general in humanity. I feel like that gives it that extra feel of you're building on something, and you're not just merely adapting, and because I mean, this is, I'm trying to be quite impartial here, but like some people might want to describe things like evolution and adaptation as some form of logic. These adaptive agents like genomes or species or groups of cells or whatever, they are navigating the space of possibilities in some abstract, in some virtual space of potential phenotypes or things like that. And then maybe you can interpret those as being logical in some sense. They are, you know, trial and error, and they're doing some kind of deductive process. The selection process is a sort of deductive process in a way. But on the other hand, a lot of people will be quite hard pressed to agree that cells are logical, are using logic, like actual logic, to operate, or living beings are using logic to evolve in time, right? Or a cellular automaton, which is, you know, very basically implemented, it's just running, and sure, it might have some emergent phenomenon, but it doesn't seem right to just say all those systems are somehow performing logic at some level. It feels like you need some particular patterns of recursiveness or self-reference or something like that allows you to maybe store memory, to build narratives and to build consistent representations. I know that's a loaded word, but, you know, things like that, and then you can start to talk about truth and false states in some sense, and this is compounded, in my opinion, by the fact that truth and false I've always regarded as a direct consequence of our personal, I mean, by our I mean higher mammals and many animals, many, let's say, chordates or something, that have a quite direct correlation. So we are reinforcement learners, right, in a way. So we have all this reinforcement chemicals, reward chemicals, that and pain chemicals, right? So we have this spectrum of discomfort and pleasure that is quite one-dimensional in some sense, right? It's quite a scale from pain to pleasure, and there's not much, you know, dimensions that you can explore beyond that. And I've always seen the truth values as very directly correlated with that, right? Like whenever you have, you know, reward, you're probably getting closer to something like you would select as truth in some more cognitively advanced way. And similarly, with discomfort comes dissonance or misalignment and so on, and so that leads to falsehood or something like that. So anyway, it's just to throw more tinder to the fire, just to make it grow large and bright, because the discussion, I think, deserves it. Okay, Memes of Distraction says in the chat, truth is more like calculus than algebra, in my opinion. Okay, interesting.
I keep thinking about the Gary-Horvath correspondence, and right.
Which one?
So the Gary-Horvath between proofs and computations. So if they're the same, what you said about logic is not quite the same as computation, kind of.
So can you explain? I've actually never heard that name before.
It's the Curry-Howard correspondence.
I haven't heard of it. Can you explain?
Well, that it's about the correspondence that logical proofs are basically the same as computations. You can go from your propositions, truth, or in the type theory, like true types, true statements, false statements, all the functions. You can all the same. Your implication is the function type. Your like true proposition is some special type that can be instantiated. Your false type or proposition that is false can be instantiated. Like it's an empty type. You know, this is like the whole correspondence between types or like logical propositions, right? Or functions, implications, all the Boolean logical connectives, I guess that's called, like conjunctions, disjunctions. They all have correspondent types in the computational world, right? So it's like if you have a function of some special type, it would, if you can instantiate it with an actual value, you basically prove that it's true. So, right? I don't know.
Yeah,
it's a very interesting correspondence. So people who know Haskell, it's like should know all about it. Basically, in order to program it very well, to be a fan of it, you have basically do this kind of logic in a functional way. instantiation type, like making a bunch of algebraic types and then writing functions that are instances of those types.
Richard, you're saying something?
Yeah, I always think of it as the phrase like proofs as programs, in that, and Nick was saying types, like type inhabitation. As a program is running, like every step is some kind of constructively generated state, which, can link to the previous. And so you have this sort of chain of,
Inference,
although, yeah.
logical inference is the same as function application or whatever. One step, it's even very related when you do some logic. They usually like this, have this notation with this horizontal line when there is input and output, and you're doing a logical inference. But in programming or computation, you do essentially the same. You apply a rule or a function, and you do the computation. You get some arguments as inputs, and you produce a result as an output.
So how does that help with the question of the origin of logic?
Well, it shows
So
this
just,
correspondence between logic and computation.
Yeah, we're just trying to narrow this gap or destroy it between logic and computation, because I see it basically as the same. There's no difference.
Sure, but I think my point was I don't know if I needed that result to like explicitly to understand that logic is going to be computation. But I mean, I appreciate that's a very explicit way of saying yes, that it is explicitly computation in this sense. But the question is whether, would you call any kind of computation logic? Probably not, right?
Well, I mean, you get things like 3-valued, 4-valued logic. And to speak to what you were saying about the sort of binary truth values originating from, say, reward signal polarity, maybe there's something there to say about that.
Well, there are different computational models, but they're all interconvertible. So maybe you can imagine one that is not quite like logic, but then you can convert one into whatever you think, like just rewriting rules. And rewriting rules are, I think, most closely resemble the logical inferences.
And there's reasoning. I mean, like things like the Hilbert deductive system, those kinds of things. That's where you start bridging into like reasoning, and then your sort of inductive, deductive, abductive reasoning. There's also things like temporal logic, higher order logic. And how do these things all link to like set theory, model theory, recursion theory, proof theory, even the way math. I mean, when we were looking at metamath, I started thinking a bit about this, about how you start from these very simple things and start inventing symbols, search for axioms, find proofs, equivalences between proofs. But it's all sort of an extension of the underlying logic and reasoning apparatus, whatever. And yeah, my favorite sort of like logic programming as well I find is much neglected, but it's sort of, you're operating on these horn clauses, and you're doing some interesting things there. And there's connections between it and rewriting. At least I have found some references which link the two in nice ways.
So maybe we can focus a little bit on the binary truth value part and how we feel about multi-valued logic. I mean, does it make any sense to go? I mean, in what sense is it right to call that logic? I think exploring that question, I think, clarifies a little bit and illuminates a little bit the general question of the origin of logic, because I don't know, how do you feel about multi-valued logic?
Well, I was actually going to start going into like incompleteness and Gödel's work, but I just found here that in 1932 he was working on this many-valued logic thing, and he defines like Gn as In a similar manner, he defined logic with infinitely many truth value, G infinity, in which the truth values are real numbers, the interval 0 to 1. So, he was thinking about extending many valued logic up to sort of infinity logics. Um, it's kind of interesting. I didn't know that he had worked on that. Not to jump from binary to many to infinity, but yeah.
I mean, I feel like, to be honest, in a way, if you have something like 0 to 1 interval,
Mhm.
that feels quite natural in some sense, right?
Probabilities and so forth.
Yeah, some kind of probabilistic interpretation. I feel it's much more interesting to think about, what if you have three truth values and none of them correspond to true and false,
Hmm.
right? I mean, what does that even mean? I
Yeah.
think that's where, sure, there's no issue. You can have an algebra. You can give it. I mean, we like this algebra. I don't know if I've ever mentioned. I don't think I've ever mentioned it in the context of the institute. But there's this algebra that, I mean, different people call it differently, but I like to call it the color algebra, because it's basically the algebra of additive color.
Mhm.
When you think about it. So it has several names. I mean, it's a semi-ring in some sense. It's commutative semi-ring in some senses. But basically, you have RGB, you have black, and you have the pairs of RGB colors, and you have white,
Mhm.
right? And you have a binary operation, which is some kind of mixing or composition or something, whatever you want to call it, which is associative and commutative. And then you have a particular behavior, which is, I mean, it's not a group because there are no inverses, and it is. Yeah, I mean, it is a semi-group, of course, but there is no. But the white is a saturating element, right? So it's similar to the Boolean algebra, where the truth value is saturating, right? That 1 plus 1
Yeah.
is 1. In that
So you have
context.
so you have like a truth cube instead of a little truth table, right? Because you've got the extra
Yeah.
dimension.
Yeah, and I mean the nice way to visualize it is like a color space, right? So you have
Yeah.
like the white, the black, and the RGB, and the magenta,
green, yeah,
teal,
yeah.
and yellow, whatever. And then if you combine any two mixes, you get white. If you combine any of the three single colors, you get white. So it's this kind of, and if you add black to anything, it gets the same thing, right? So there's a neutral element, and there's an absorbent element. White is absorbent, like 0 for multiplication, in the integers, for example. But you also have this phenomenon of saturating, right? Like when you multiply sufficiently many different elements of your algebra, you eventually get white, and you never grow from white, right?
Mhm.
Which is, in my opinion, is very close to the behavior of the Boolean binary algebra, right? Because it's like true and true is true, and that's going to be true forever, right? Like it doesn't matter how much truth you add to truth, it's going to be truth, right? So to me this is similar, and I quite like the example because it completely breaks this usual feeling of logic of true and false, and like dichotomies of checking and in this binary way. But algebraically you're extremely close to that behavior, right? You have it's same commutative, associative, and I think people have made it work. If I'm not mistaken, you can define difference or subtractive color mixing, and I think that gives you lattice in the same way that the Boolean algebra is lattice, but I'm not sure because I always just studied the single operation construction, not the two operations. But anyway, it's a neat example that has pretty much all the desirable algebraic properties of the Boolean algebra, but it's nowhere near true false kind of. I wonder if Wait, is that true? No, because that's not true. Because black and white is actually is a Boolean subalgebra in black and white. Right? I mean, if
I think usually when they discuss ternary logic, there's like the third value is something representing like an undecidable proposition.
yeah, that's another option. Yeah, yeah. But I find that that's a little bit like that's not so much ternary. I mean, sure, they call it ternary logic because it is, but that's more like adding a truth value, and this other system. I mean, to be honest, I mean this color algebra has a Boolean subalgebra. Actually, black and white are a Boolean subalgebra, which is kind of neat in my opinion, because it's quite I don't know, poetic. Black and white and true and false work the same way. It's like if you subtract black from white, you get black, or you get white, and it's. I think it's the same behavior. I mean, I actually now wonder if you define subtractive color addition, color mixing, and additive color mixing, whether they are gonna distribute. So that you can definitely say that they are an analog for Boolean algebra, because that's the only thing missing. The subtractive mixing and additive mixing are both commutative and associative. So, and you have black and white as a Boolean subalgebra for sure. I just need to know whether additive color distributes over subtractive color, which feels very strange. I don't think it does. Shouldn't be able to, right? So if you have a imagine you have some kind of multiset of RGB.
Mm-hmm.
If you do additive, if you do subtractive, I think you have to add like the subtractive mixes, which are like brown and the other colors, like other three colors. In that case, you might be able to make it work.
You mean the inverse colors?
Yeah.
Like they have for quarks? Not? They usually color them like magenta.
No, that's funny because that's actually when they define inverse colors in QCD, they actually just those are just the mixed colors. They just so happen to be also -1 in the representation in the root diagram. They happen to be minus the primary color, but it's kind of unfortunate because you I don't think you want to define the opposite color to red to be the mix of blue and green, right? Like what the hell is that? Like it makes no sense to me. Right? And that's what they do. I think they do it because everything has to add up to 0, right? So it's a technical inverse. That because red plus minus red equals 0, but also red plus blue plus green equals 0. They are like, red plus green, blue plus green equals minus red. So that's what they do. I don't like it because it's kind of it kind of collapses the. I mean, it's just an analogy. It's fine. Like obviously, what they do is correct. Like I'm not criticizing the actual model, but the naming is a bit misguided in my opinion, because why would you? It doesn't make sense. But yeah, I mean, that's a different. Yeah, you want to have, I think, because if you do subtractive mixing of primary colors, you get nothing in some sense, right? Like for subtractive mixing to work, you need to define what the subtractive mixes of the pairs are. I mean, how they. So you have three primary colors in the middle, then three pairs of additive mixes on top, three pairs of subtractive mixes at the bottom, and then black at the bottom and then white at the top. And I think that model you can make it work, and so it becomes a lattice. So it becomes more like a Boolean algebra, like a ternary, not ternary, but a higher order Boolean algebra. Because it's still the composition is still. I don't want to say binary. I want to say arity agnostic, because you can compose as many elements as you want, and it doesn't matter. It's commutative and associative, so everything goes. But the number of elements in the algebra is bigger. I mean, that's actually a cool question. Now I'm curious about that now, because I don't. Let's see. I'm actually curious about the lattice.
Well, I think Joel's original question, though, was about the emergence of the kind of phenomenon of logic amongst humans. I think it's fair to say we've mostly discussed it as a matter of computation. As for why humans think this way, or we find logic to be particularly natural or compelling, I mean, I don't have an answer to that.
Yeah, I mean,
On
actually,
this,
yeah, we should return to the human. Sorry, go ahead.
No,
We should return.
No, I found this paper, DNA logic gates. There's a Nature one, but it's paywalled. So, I found one here. I wonder if we would find like the many-valued idea sort of popping up there. I mean, these researchers sort of identify some genes and some processes which function as logic gates. It doesn't really answer the question of like why do humans do it, but if it's something that emerges at many levels, then you could say that it's unsurprising that we do it, because it's sort of, yeah, it's like built into us and at many levels of physical reality itself anyway. So it's sort of no surprise that the humans would find themselves doing it. I mean, and then look at our brains themselves, that they have this sort of threshold function as well, that you can quite easily. Well, we used to think that Boolean functions needed multi-layer networks, but then they found that dendrites actually perform and an XOR, and so they can perform the XOR function, within the dendrites, not within. You don't even need multi-layer networks. So, I mean, biology has managed to find many places to put these complicated logical functions. And it fooled us. That's the point. We thought, you need multi-layer networks in order to separate the truth table. If you know the XOR problem, then it's one of those introductory problems which motivates multi-layer networks. But biology found ways of sneaking it into the dendrites, which are some sort of substructure of a neuron, really.
But I still wonder what is involved in the actual brain. Even if you give me a very simple Boolean formula and I solve it, how are we doing that? And is it any different from, let's say I'm not a logician, but I'm having some argument with someone,
Oh yeah.
over a house or something, and someone uses like a double negative, and I say it doesn't make any sense. I hope someone has done a study like that, which is, how much do we know about what the brain does when we do logic? How much do we know about what the brain does when we're simply exercising some degree of formal reasoning?
Likely still somewhat culturally contingent, though perhaps there are some.
Ooh, it just happened.
There's some feedback there.
James?
Yes, am I still here?
Yeah. I mean, suddenly you sounded like filtered with like 10 million processes of the sound.
Was it the echo cancellation went
Yeah,
a
it
bit,
was
a
weird.
bit
It was
wrong?
weird.
Oh,
An
yeah,
old
sorry.
TV broadcast or something.
No,
Old
nothing,
radio.
nothing happened on my side. Everyone just
Okay.
was suddenly
Um,
awestruck.
I would,
Yeah, I mean, so
yeah, just to answer that, I'm aware of some. It's not directly logic, but it's mathematical cognition in general. There's
Mhm.
there's some nice literature on mathematical cognition. That people have studied humans doing mathematics versus doing other tasks. Particularly, there's been a lot of work on arithmetic, and I don't know. I always see modern mathematics as being basically the result of three fundamental experiences, human experiences. One is counting, the other is convincing other people, and the other is looking at shapes and rotating them in space. That's about it. that's mathematics in sort of in the flesh, so to speak. So I think logic is the closer to the convincing others to do things, which I think to answering Joel's question would probably have to pass by something along those lines, because logic, I mean, one way, I mean, historically, this is why I mentioned in the beginning that history sometimes is illuminating to know what we're dealing with. Historically, logic was developed for dialectics, right? For public speaking and the politics and convincing and so on. It was philosophy came from that more than the other way around, right? So the abstract science of logic and reasoning and propositions and so on that Aristotle is so famous for, it was actually a distilled version of the distilled version of the distilled version that eventually, you can trace back to, some people in some town square just debating and trying to convince each other to do different complicated things, right? So I think that is quite genetic in logic, right? Like the component of construct arguments and reach a success state, which is you've been convinced in some sense, which is where you eventually abstract as truth, right? It's like, okay, you reach the truth state, but in practice, this was most often just convincing people to do things, right? And obviously, if the people around you work like machines, like like you want to pretend mathematicians do in some sense, then the process of dialectics with mathematicians really discover formal logic, right? In some sense. But originally, it doesn't necessarily, and so that's why I find it interesting to think about, logic in a more. So, in what sense is an octopus that never sees other octopi in its life doing logic, right? I mean, they're extremely intelligent. They clearly do things that are like very strategic and they're deliberate in some sense. But in what sense are they reasoning or deriving like logical conclusions? I wonder, because I feel like our truth state hungry mind, I think, is a very social mind in some sense, and language. I mean, by social I mostly mean language, right? Like language evolved to communicate in some sense, and I wonder how much of that is relevant for the essence of logic in some sense, and whether if you lose that, then it's no longer logic. And I don't know.
By the way, Carlos, when you were discussing the study of the human cognition of math, have you read this? There's this book by, I think it's George Lakoff, Rafael Nunez,
Yep.
Where Mathematics Comes From, how the
I have not
mind.
read the whole thing, but I know the book. I've read, I think, a couple of chapters because I met Rafael Nunez. Actually, I know him.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So would you say, is he a part of that community?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
He's a yeah. See, he was, we actually had a few conversations with him about this mathematical cognition stuff, and he was quite intrigued by, for example, these notions of higher order stuff and higher logics and so on, because, I mean, as you can imagine, if you have cognitive scientists coming at mathematics and trying to investigate they are going to have most of the time, not always, but most of the time, they're going to have some quite cartoonish view of mathematics, right? So that's why arithmetic has been completely overstudied, right? In human mathematical cognition, arithmetic has been, you know, it's 99% of the literature on mathematical cognition is on arithmetic, right? And it makes sense because it's in some sense it's like a mathematical skill that almost every human develops, but when you have this you know, you have papers on mathematicians doing work and the cognitive science of mathematicians and the philosophy of mathematical practice and so on, and they're very strongly based on arithmetic, and I think people get the wrong idea when I mean we did this conference where how I met Stephen in the first place, about the concept of number, right, where we gathered all manner of scientists and philosophers to discuss the concept of number, and obviously in that context it was very appropriate that everyone was talking about arithmetic and so on, but mathematical cognition scientist, I guess is the only word I can use for them, when they were describing arithmetic as a mathematical phenomenon, they were very fixated on the fact that, you know, numbers represent quantity, and quantity is something that you can also judge cognitively without formal mathematical analysis, right? So this I think distracted the conversation quite a lot, because, you know, there's all this debate about subitizing, and, you know, subitizing is this ability to like ascertain how many objects you see, right? It's like you see 4, you can do it, 5, you can, 6, then 10, 9, impossible, right? Like you can no longer, and so that phenomenon, they were quite fixating on that, because they said, but okay, so we can count well past, and you have all this anthropological evidence of, you know, different cultures that never developed names for numbers greater than 3 and things like that. And so they were very fixating on the fact that, oh yeah, we have arithmetic where we have symbolic representations of arbitrary numbers, particularly arbitrary large numbers, and I think that completely distracted the conversation, and they started thinking, oh yeah, because we can do an operation on millions and millions and then subtract another millions, and they were thinking somehow that the fact that they represent a big quantity was somehow relevant, and they were kind of oblivious to the fact that at that point all you're doing is symbolic manipulation, and there's no difference between computing millions and millions, or, you know, adding red to blue, and it's like it's just formally the same. And I think they were missing quite dramatically the point that humans, by virtue of several cognitive adaptations that we have, we're very, very prone to symbolic manipulation, right? We're very eager to just take a symbol and interpret it, and then build on it, and then interpret it again and build on it, and so on. And they were kind of oblivious to that. It was a bit shocking to see, you know, many expert cognitive scientists just not noticing the fact that what is going on in arithmetic is just a simple example of something that is very general, which is symbolic manipulation and symbolic algebra, right? So yeah, I'm proud to say that we managed to get some of them, you know, pay attention to that. And it's like, all right, you know, so this is symbolic algebra is okay. It's quite a general phenomenon, and we shouldn't be so fixated that these are numbers and large quantities are represented with small symbols and things like that. But yeah, things are getting updated. Like there's a lot of philosophy on diagram use in mathematics and things like that. And, but yeah, on logic, however, I think there must be. I mean, what was the most interesting? If I can remember some experiment. Can't quite remember, because I mean mathematical cognition was the most interesting for me, was the sort of the breadth of mathematical abilities across different cognitive systems, not only humans, right? When you see like corvids doing subtraction and things like that, or generally animals counting quite well and keeping track of fairly difficult arithmetic, the average adult human will struggle with. Things like that were quite interesting. Also, plants doing some form of counting, that I found that quite interesting as well. That they were, so there was this particular case where a carnivorous plant the Venus flytrap, I think in particular, has this pili inside the sort of the moss, right? And so if you stimulate once, it closes. If you stimulate twice, it remains closed. Stimulate 3 times, remains closed. Stimulate 4 times, remains closed. Stimulate 5 times, then it starts digesting the thing it has inside. So basically, to prevent the waste of digestive fluids and so on when it's like a false catch, right? So basically, if the fly is kind of moving around and it's constantly triggering the pili, then so it's interesting because they count exactly to 5. Like the number 5 is somehow perfectly computed. It's not like, okay, enough times and sort of a Gaussian. It's like they exactly count to 5. So and nobody knows how they do it. Like they don't know exactly what's the mechanism that's counting to 5. And so the number 5 is somewhere in the plant, right? But nobody knows where. So these things are. That I'm just giving context that this is where the mathematical cognition was interesting, but to speak about the origin of logic, like, okay, maybe it's a good example to build on. So would you say that this plant is actually, counting when it's probably some people will be super quick to say, no, it's some feedback loop. It's just a dynamical system that, once you trigger it 5 times because obviously you have to trigger it 5 times within some refractory period, right? Like otherwise it just opens. I mean, of course, you can build that kind of like thermostat system where it's just, just accumulate enough signal, then it triggers, and it so happens that it always accumulates at 5 triggers, or a five stimuli. But it's and something interesting about that as well. This was what made it interesting, is that they could learn that false signals were being fed to them, and they could actually lower the number. So. Or increase the number, so they could actually adapt. So it seems that by default, they grow to know that 5 is the right number in some sense. And if you do this experiment with most plants, you will get very consistently number 5. But if you like overstimulate them or something, they start to adapt and they say, well, in this environment, I'm getting too many like false catches or something, and they start to go up to 6 or up to 7, and so that's what makes it really intriguing. But anyway, the field of plant cognition is really quite fascinating. I invite everyone to read on it. It's quite cool.
I wish it were the case that the plants have little binary values inside and a little arithmetic logic unit that keeps. No, I'm joking. There's another example that's worth mentioning. These primate experiments, disjunctive syllogism or something. It normally only appears in children aged 3, and it's one African grey parrot, but they managed to show that macaques are capable of it using some experiment called the 2-cylinder hidden item task. I don't know much about it, but it shows that they're able to perform quite complicated reasoning. They call it disjunctive syllogism or whatever.
Okay.
I don't know exactly about it, but yeah, that's kind of cool that they're able to.
What's an example of one that they?
Well, so yeah, the task is like they have these 4 cups and they put items, and it's some kind of like logical concepts are involved, or and not in terms of like, will the reward be given? And I mean, the experiment's all about showing that they can go from poor performance to sort of knowing how to know what the logical formula is that's actually being presented to them through this task. And yeah, like as it says, children need to be at 3 before they can exhibit this capability, and they've only shown it in some African grey parrot. They haven't shown it in any other animal. Macaque, African grey parrot, and any human above or equal to age 3. So yeah, there's something about the way our brains bootstrap themselves that we need time to be able to even solve such a task. And it's surprising that it takes 3 years.
So what is it? Wait, hold on. You put some ball in a cup, and you're rearranging the cups, and they have to track the ball. Is that right?
So it's like a grape goes into one of 2 cylinders, another grape goes into one of another 2, and then the animal. Actually, I was wrong. It's baboons here, but I first read it was macaques. So they must have. Anyway, it's presented with this thing to make a decision, and it's 1 second. Sorry. I think the researchers sort of determine what the logical formula is in a particular case. So they're using like the position of the grape as some sort of truth value, and then the outcome as the actual sort of, the circuit that they want it to try and learn, or, and it's just showing that the animal can sort of acquire, can learn this sort of logical function, this Boolean logic function, and through I mean, so it's like if it didn't have that capability, its reinforcement learning mechanisms just wouldn't be able to find the function.
Yeah, that's interesting, because that's in line with what I was saying earlier, that logic seems to be quite closely related to reward or attention or something
Actually,
like that.
yes, it's a concrete example of it.
Yeah, it's a very concrete example of what I was saying earlier. It's like, imagine all the stuff that's going on around you all the time that you just literally don't care about. It's like you've been sort of primed to like focus your attention, and then when you focus your attention, you have this landscape of reward, or both positive and negative, right? Like you have this feedback. Let's call it feedback, both positive and negative, right? And I find this, honestly, if I were pressed right now, like, to me, this is the origin of logic. To give some kind of conclusive remark to the question, like, to me, at a personal level, I have no solid scientific evidence or like some set of papers that actually point strongly in this direction. But from my intuition, from what I know, I feel like that's the origin of logic. And in fact, I've used it in the past more as a sort of derogatory or kind of limiting argument to the power of logic in some sense. Because, if you focus too much, I mean, it's great when what you care about is optimizing and, this feedback landscape, right? But there are times that you don't care about the feedback landscape. You just want to explore, for example, right? You literally just, you want to see as much as possible, and your reward is just more stuff, not the good or bad stuff, right? So in those
call
cases,
that exploitation, exploration in sort of biological.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think mathematics has been a bit too much feedback landscape oriented, and I like it when it's just use different, because I mean in a way. By the way, we are in the community forum technically still, but so it's fine to make this connection, but this is also quite related, in my opinion, to a lot of political debate, where there's a very strong tendency, is very, very pervasive tendency to always derive, or push debates towards morality, or is this right or wrong? Is this polarization of how you parse reality? I mean, at the end of the day, it's the same thing, right? It's good and evil is basically the density of positive feedback or negative feedback in your environment in some sense, right? So it's in a way, like, I feel like it hampers when you're trying to have a very analytical debate and just sort of try to chart the ground and see what the reality is, and before passing any judgments or saying I think this should be changed because this is better or something else. This tendency is always an obstacle, right? Because people, I mean, I experience it, I don't know, with friends or family or whatever, that you're discussing a topic, and then people are extremely quick to say, no, but that's wrong, or no, that's bad, or and it's like, sure, but I don't care. It's like, that's not the point. We want to chart the land first. I want to see, and then maybe you can value your feedback or your moral function on top of this landscape, and then it gets some from 0 to 1 or -1 to 1 values. But before you do that, like, it's worth getting all the structure, right? All the richness of the thing, and not so much the moral values. I feel it's a similar phenomenon.
False dichotomies everywhere, and like, when you mentioned politics, I was thinking this whole left-right separation seems extremely limiting to kind of reduce somebody to this false dichotomy.
That's funny, actually. I mean, I guess left-right is funny because, I mean, left and right, like, obviously the fact that it's a dichotomy that's going to be the most natural one that humans go for. I mean, because it's the simplest form of us versus them, right? So you're going to be favored. But I think the fact that it's left and right, not the words or the term that left and right, I don't point to that. The fact that it's two of them, when you think what they mean, like economically and historically and so on, it's a little bit of a coincidence in a way, of historical coincidence nowadays. Because if you look at, I don't know, Middle Ages, I think you would have more of a split between, say, peasants, clergy, and nobles, and instead of just a split between ideologies that is kind of like, are you more to the right or more to the left in this particular axis of ideology? That, I mean, I don't think politics nowadays are so cleanly described by this axis, but at some point in late 19th century or something, we're quite, that was a quite strong classifier of people in societies, right? But I feel like we live it. That's kind of a bit of a, sure. It's also along the axis of wealth and power, so it makes sense.
The origin's funny. I didn't know this. French Revolution, 1789. Members of National Assembly were divided into supporters of the king, whatever. I mean, one of them actually sat on his left and on his right.
It was the site of some French Revolution room. I remember that.
So it is kind of like a one-dimensional space, they, just by virtue of on my left, on my right. We have two hands. And,
no, for sure. But I do think that if you analyze it as a discourse between ideologies, right? The fact that it's two of them, it's also, I think it probably also is connected to how big wars were fought. Like normally they tended to form two sides and fight each other because that's, cheaper strategically in a way, or tactically. But yeah, I think it's interesting that we find ourselves in that sort of paired ideology, because I think in a different moment in history in Europe, just to place Europe as reference, I think you would have found a different kind of split. Obviously, you're always going to have this axis of wealth and power that's more or less linear, that is more like a pyramid in some sense. Like that's always going to be present, and I think left and right kind of aligns with that axis in some sense, at least historically, for sure, right? Like, I mean, labor movements at the bottom and capitalist movements at the top. I mean, it makes sense, right? But I don't think that was necessarily an accurate description of, say, some feudal societies didn't have that. I mean, sure, you have very, top-down power, but I feel like it was more like there's the noble class, there's the clergy class, and there's the free man class in some sense. And they're quite different ideologies, right? Like they were operating under quite different objectives, what to do, and moral standards, and So anyway, just an aside that I think the binariness of the political spectrum is I think it's a bit of a historical coincidence that we are living in, but I don't think there's beyond the obvious remarks that we've made.
I think for anyone who's spent any time understanding the never-ending fission and divides within political circles, that, like, I mean, even if you take, say, the left, is like, was Lenin left wing? Well, many people on the left were criticizing him as being like the most right-wing left winger that you can imagine, right? Because it had some whole dictatorship of the proletariat. They had like a vanguard approach. It was very much a few people kind of seizing power, and so other people on the left are saying this is a complete distortion of what we have. And then on the other hand, you'll have people accusing people on the right for being too left wing, and so I don't see any. And then especially once you start to consider all the different themes on which left or right positions disagree, it's incredibly nuanced, I think.
Oh yeah, for sure.
The positions that people take.
Yeah, I would add that just to reinforce what we just said, that if everyone has this axis on their minds about right and wrong, right? If you assume that you have this field of agents that think mostly in terms of right and wrong and want to project this sort of Boolean valuation on the world, right? It seems like a very likely state that everyone will separate into two groups, and then mostly people from the in group would attribute positive values to the in group and negative values to the out group, and vice versa, right? Because that seems like a stable configuration, right? Like
Yeah.
if you have three, suddenly it's not so clear that you can do that, because you have to. I mean, if they are quite, if there's strong identity in the three, you have to start, using ternary logic in some sense, or ternary morals in a way. It's like, and that's incidentally that's what my most politically active phase when I was in the first year uni, second year uni. There was this student revolution, or quote unquote revolution here in Spain. I think we achieved what the problem was, which is we had a very bipartite political system. It was just left and right, two parties, quite corrupt, both of them, and so the entire student movement was about, let's revamp this. We want more parties to throw in, and then we ended up with 4 or 5 parties, and it was, I think, quite healthy in the beginning. Then you see, it's actually quite interesting because you perturb the system, you throw in a couple new parties, and then they shuffle things around. Things become more interesting. Debates were no longer between two candidates; they were between like 4, 5, 6 candidates, and I think that's very positive because then suddenly ideas become more relevant and so on. But that's besides the point. What I like about it is the sort of dynamical systems perspective, where you perturb the system, and then after how many years now, like 10, 12 years since then, like the system is basically rearranged back to two big blocks. It's like it's quite funny. I mean, you still have more parties now. I mean, that's good. There's more party diversity, but there's also quite a homogeneous kind of two blocks, left and right, which was not the case in the first year after the first election, where the revolution happened. So anyway, it's funny to think about it. But on that note, I think we should probably move to roundtable. So what I'm going to do is actually going to do an experiment. Do we want to reset the meeting for any reason?
Just so that the recording.
Oh yeah, the
is
recording. Yes,
separate.
of course. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's reconvene in 1 or 2 minutes.
Okay. All right. Thanks, everyone. See you at the next forum. Bye bye.